Hi, I'm Peter Katz. I'm a singer-songwriter, speaker, and facilitator, and I work with companies and organizations of all stripes to help them and their people show up wholeheartedly and work towards creating inspired future visions. Today on the show, we're going to talk about reinvention, how we pass through the eye of the needle, and what is really required to pull you through to that inspiring future vision. We're also going to talk about changing the lens of how we approach our problems, from this kind of uninspired lens to this lens of possibility that we never could have even imagined. We're going to talk about breaking the mold of who you thought you were meant to be, which can actually facilitate this even greater expression of who you truly are. And we're going to talk about why music can play a really important and surprising role in all of that.
Welcome back to part two of our delicious conversation with Peter Katz. He is a JUNO Award, Canadian Screen Award-nominated singer-songwriter who shared the stage and studios with very famous people. His music and videos have been streamed over 40 million times. And in case you're wondering what he's doing on a leadership show, we talked about in part one this reinvention. And that reinvention is this word that's sort of thrown around in the leadership space, in the business space. But what does it actually mean? And in part one of the show, we talked about Peter's reinvention from being a guy who was out on the road 150, 200 times a year, driving for miles and miles across Canada for hours upon end to sleep on floors, to play small concerts. And then suddenly something happened, and he suddenly realized that there was a whole other side to him that would require not only a reinvention, but a transformation. And one of the things we talked a lot about in part one of the show was that a lot of what stops us from becoming the truly magnificent human that we are capable of being is that we've built confines, oftentimes around a career or an identity, a specialization, and we say, this is who I am. And we don't realize how much more of us is available and how we can bring those skills to other things. So as I said, Peter was a full-time musician, and then suddenly there was this other world that opened up to him really through a kids group in Canada. So if you didn't catch it, I really encourage you to go back and listen to it, because it's a fascinating story, a fascinating understanding of what reinvention is. And I talked about that in part one, that reinvention is this term that's thrown around, but people don't really understand it until they're confronted with it. And I also talked about that there's this yearning for normal that a lot of leaders have. I can't wait for things to get back to normal and people start coming back to work or whatever it is, or when this is over or that's over, it'll all return to normal. Normal doesn't exist. It's already gone. There's a new normal, and that is whatever the weirdness is of the moment. That's the normal for now, and that won't be normal in 10 minutes from now. And the one thing that I know, and Peter and I spoke about this actually off air when we first met through a mutual friend, is that the pandemic changed everything. Now, we can get into conspiracy theories or a whole bunch of other stuff, but psychologically it changed everything because it made people reevaluate their lives. When the pandemic came along for you as a guy who had been doing these crazy amounts of concerts a year, I mean, I interviewed somebody who puts on Broadway shows, and and he talked about the devastation it brought to that world, not just to the people who are putting on the shows, but to every actor and every people who worked in the back at these productions. What was that like for you as a muso to suddenly everything's ground to a halt?
Well, it was quite the moment. I remember I had a keynote on March 12th, 2020, and it was for a major bank here in Canada. And I was right after lunch. And obviously this was the moment where, like a case here, a case there would pop up, and it was everybody was sort of getting a little bit freaked out. And the person that was supposed to introduce me and read my bio before I walked out instead informed the entire audience that one of the other business analysts that had been working on their same floor had a suspected case of COVID, and at that point it was that was terrifying. And so she had to inform them that they were legally allowed to go home, like HR, if they wanted to. They didn't, but there was these giant vats of hand sanitizer on every table, and everybody was just sort of dousing themselves in it. And I remember loading my gear into the car and thinking to myself, my life is probably about to change a little bit. And sure enough,
wow, that's a very mild response. I think mine would have had a lot more F-bombs in it.
Yeah, well, I'm Canadian, so
exactly. Oh, I'm sorry.
Exactly. So over the course of the next several weeks, every keynote, every concert, every single thing I had in my calendar disappeared for the foreseeable future. And not only that, but at this point, my music career had actually started to go quite well, and my speaking career was also really starting to surge at that point. And so I had bought my first condo, and I my first time ever being able to buy a place. And so I had kind of drained all of my resources, and I was like, well, it's no problem because I got all these keynotes coming up. And so I actually had $2,000 left in the bank in that exact moment. And then all of my work disappeared. And so I had a major panic attack, and I did and I didn't, in the sense that I've kind of been this like sort of survivor spirit my whole life. And I had an intuition that I immediately, I was like, okay, if things are going to go virtual right now, then how am I going to do this really, really well? And so I took that money that I had and I bought a camera. I didn't know anything about streaming or any of the technology at all, but I knew I had done my degree in theater. And I remember when we were studying the difference between theater and film, like when they invented film, they didn't just place a camera in the middle of the theater and then call that a film, right? Because that's a terrible film. What doing film allowed them to do is it allowed you to get close-ups, and maybe in a giant theater, somebody raising their eyebrow, you don't even see it, but on film, it could send a chill down your spine, right? And so I remember having this vision of, okay, if I'm going to be doing things virtually, whether that's keynotes or musical performances, I can't think of this as how do I just put a camera in front of what I was already doing? It's how do I produce something? And the tagline that I had in my mind was okay, it's got to be like Netflix, but the guy is talking back to you in real time. Right. And so I just locked myself in my basement, and I started watching videos and reading articles and just sort of visioning of okay, how can I produce a TV show from my living room that's of a quality that's going to differentiate me? And I also learned, some video editing skills, and I cut together a virtual speaking reel, which at the time I was literally one of the first people ever to do that. And so I kind of positioned myself as this virtual keynote speaker that wasn't just going to be open a laptop and give a keynote. It was going to be of a really high quality. And as I mentioned, in the last episode, my topic, was all of a sudden really relevant, where organizations kind of needed that care for the people. They wanted to have moments of joy. And so I'm offering music, I'm offering connection, these kind of skill sets that were all of a sudden really relevant. And so it took about 6 months, because nobody was booking anything for a period of months, but I just kept refining the setup. And by the time September of 2020 hit, my schedule exploded. I remember one week in that September, I had 9 keynotes in 3 days. And I went from having, no money and being like seemingly on sort of death's door financially, to having month after month after month after month of the best months I had ever had. And over the course of, the 18 months of the kind of core time of the pandemic, I performed virtually for 150,000 people, and completely changed my life. So it ended up being like the worst thing to being the best thing that's ever happened to me. And which I feel sort of weird saying that, because I realize lives were lost, and, it was a global tragedy.
Again, we're coming back to that point that I made earlier.
Yeah.
Which is, it gets better, it gets much better, then it gets worse, then it gets different.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And most people will pack it in when it gets worse.
Yeah.
Right. So, it got better. You were having more success. You were getting more concerts. You get more people. You get more keynotes.
Yeah.
Got much better. You get more keynotes now, as well as more concerts. And then it gets really bad, really painful.
Yeah.
Thank you, COVID. I've just shot myself in the ass because now I've got a mortgage and a condo.
Mm-hmm.
I've got $2,000 and I'm spending money on a bloody camera. Sane people go, "Oh, you've lost the plot, mate. You're buying a camera. Yeah. You're not even sure if you can pay your mortgage, let alone buy a sandwich." So, I'm really interested for leaders to grasp what that mindset is, Peter. When other people, so right now there's a lot of talk as we're recording this, a lot of talk about potential recession, inflation rates, blah blah blah. And some people are like tightening every belt. And some people, I think are smarter people, are saying, where do we need to invest?
Yeah.
Where do we need to invest? And that for me is a key point here that I think I want to have you get across to the audience as we're talking today, is that while other people were tightening their belt and freaking the hell out, you spent money on buying a camera and putting your head down and learning how to create this world-class remote keynote that put you in front of 150,000 people. Talk to us about that mindset where you should have gone into lack, but you went into high production.
Well, I want to connect it to the facilitation kind of philosophy that I believe in, and I'm sure many people are familiar with something called appreciative inquiry.
Yes,
and the idea is typically the way that we solve our problems when we find ourselves in a difficult spot is we look at them like problems and problems to solve, and when there's a problem, you're in this sort of deficit position, right? You're looking at the lens of like, how do I fix my problem? And the best possible, fix to that is basically to get back to neutral where you had no problem. And so when you're looking at it through the lens of a problem, it's like, well, whose fault is it? What do I need to do? Like, what do I need to fix? Like, it's this very sort of, it's not really a generative lens. It's this fear lens. It's the fight or flight. It's like, how do I get back to where I was?
Yep.
Whereas,
like I said, normal yearning.
Exactly. Whereas the research around, the folks that developed appreciative inquiry uncovered is that actually, if we're able to have a lens of possibility, so if we have this future vision that we're actually inspired by, then rather than saying to ourselves like, okay, whose fault is it? What do I need to fix? It's actually this generative, this creative lens of, oh, well, how might I create that? And think about how much more motivating and inspiring and just what momentum building having that future vision creates. And so I said it earlier, I had this vision of Netflix, but the guy is talking back to me in real time. Like, that was the vision that I had. And so even though I should have been, panicking and just kind of in a corner, spending my
hope. Exactly.
Yeah. Instead, I was actually on fire. I was in flow. I was like, how do I solve this? And I'm communicating with this random tech guy in Hungary saying, "Hey, can you build me this pedal?" One of the visions that I had for the tech was I wanted to have it be really high tech, but I didn't want to be interacting with the tech in any way, because all I wanted to do was to be present with the people, so that I never wanted to use a mouse. I never wanted to use the keyboard. I wanted everything to be so that I could be performing in flow, present with the people. So I was like, okay, how am I going to do that? I was like, oh, I need like a foot controller. And it didn't really exist, the thing that I wanted. But I found this guy that could create this and could interface with this other software that this other random guy in the UK had come up with. And so I'm like putting all these things together. And in a moment where everybody is freaking out, I have this inspiring future vision that's just like, it's put me in motion. It's put me in flow. And so I really think that that's applicable is when the SHIT hits the fan, or these moments where everybody else is in panicking or fight and flight, rather than just saying like, how do we get back to where we were? It's like, well, okay, what is an inspiring future vision that I can create towards? And as you said, how do I invest in that? How do I think to myself, well, how might I create that? Because there is no doubt to me that when there is these disruptions, there's incredible opportunity, and those that are willing to take the risk and find those future visions and move towards them in those moments, it can absolutely catapult you in ways that you wouldn't even imagine.
So is that inherent in you, or is there a moment that was a turning point in your philosophy about life and as such about leadership? Was there a turning point for you?
I think it's a combination of both. So I had some sort of life experiences, my family sort of exploded when I was like 12 or 13. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. So that sort of survival response was built into me. But that said, I mean, that could become very maladaptive. You could become very fight or flight or very risk averse when something like that happens.
Sure.
But I would say I would say a few things like kind of come to mind as far as like where that comes from. So obviously part of it, well, the moment that actually emerged for me was I went through a divorce when I was back in 2015, and definitely one of the most painful moments I'd ever experienced. And I remember sitting in my car in the driveway of this house, and a bunch of my stuff was in storage, and whatever wasn't in storage was in the back of this car that's like packed to the rafters. And I was going to be of no fixed address for the next month. And because the place that I was going to be moving into, like going from a house to a basement apartment with a buddy, was not available for a month. And I remember sitting in the driveway and just this like extreme pain, knowing that I was going to pull away and like I was never going to go back in that place. But I remember being like kind of visited by this vision, where I said to myself, I made this promise with myself. I said, oh my gosh, does this ever hurt? This is so painful. And I don't want this pain to be for nothing. And it felt like kind of the first time that my eyes were kind of opening up, because like my parents got divorced. I lost my childhood house. My number one goal in life, sort of the problem solving vision was like, don't get divorced, don't lose your house. And there I was getting divorced, losing my house. So my biggest fear had come true. And now it was like, okay, I guess now I better start living and figuring this out. And so I made this conscious decision in that moment that I said, this is going to be so painful. And I want, like, may my eyes be opened. Like, let me start seeing the things that I don't know. Let me be brought to my knees and really start figuring out what it means to be alive, what it means to not operate from a place of fear. And I want this heartbreak to not make me jaded. I want it to make me even more loving than I thought was possible. And I stepped into the fire and I mean, that was like 8 years ago, and it's still emotional to think about what a long, painful journey that was. But it feels like that was the start of my life. Like that was day one in a way, because everything I had done prior to that was to just not recreate what had happened in with my parents. And now I was free from that. The biggest fear came true. So now it was like, okay, what's possible for me now?
You talked about stepping into the fire.
Yeah.
But let's face it, most people are freaking terrified of that.
Yeah.
So what do you say to that person who's standing in front of you, who is, their whole identity, their whole reality, their whole vision of themselves and their life has just gone up like, in a bunch of flames? What do you say to that person?
I mean, the first thing I would say to them, I mean, I kind of had a moment like this at the retreat that I was just running. The first thing I would say to them, is like, hey, I see you, I see how distressed you are by this. I see how painful this is. And I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly your experience, but I see how hard this is, and I care about that. And I would sort of first just acknowledge them and acknowledge that this is difficult. And then I think I would encourage them to be gentle with themselves through the process, to see it as a lifetime of work, right? It's not this is not something that you're going to just solve quickly, but like, what is the next right move? What is the first thing that one can do? And just have a gentleness, a grace, see yourself the way you would see a best friend, right? Like, we are so vicious with ourselves. And yet if we had a friend who was going through a divorce or going through a challenging time or was struggling with addiction or whatever it might be, I mean, we would look on them lovingly with compassion. We would see their potential, that this is not who they are. This is just how they are right now. So how can we gaze upon ourselves with that same compassion and gentleness, and understand that yeah, okay, the fire, it burns and it's painful, and there is a way through, one tiny increment at a time.
But that's the challenge, isn't it? I mean, that so often we are looking for, well, like I said, yearning for normal, which is definitely not going to help. Or we're just wanting the pain to go away. So as I said, so we use the mechanism, a line of cocaine, a joint, another whiskey, or whatever it might be, another cake, right? Another purchase, to try and ease that pain. And you and I can wax poetic here about not going down that road, that won't actually help you. But that's the compulsion. The compulsion is to ease the pain. If you put your hand on the hot stove, you automatically pull it away. If you put your heart on the hot stove, the impulse is to pull it away, instead of understanding that that broken heart is being broken open. It's not broken, it's being broken open. So I tell people all the time around broken hearts, your broken heart was not breaking your heart. It was breaking the armor that encased your heart that you thought was your heart. You believe the armor was you, but it's not. But it is still painful because the light is coming in on a place that has only lived in darkness. So in that context, I'm trying to have you get a message across here that where people can say, I'm going through this, or the people I love are going through this, or my family are going through this, or my employees are going through this because of a long COVID or whatever it might be. And yes, we have to be compassionate, and yes, we're in business. We have to make a profit. We have to be successful, you know. And this, for me, that's always the balancing act. Is even if we can get a CEO to join in this, they're still, you know. And I used to be under this illusion. It's like, you know, you got to work with the CEOs and the C-suite. And then I realized, oh my God, these guys. That's true because I'm old. That's true 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But now it's not true. And people go, well, what do you mean? And I go, because the CEO is only brought into 3 to 5 years. They're going to change him out and change him out for somebody they think is going to make him more profitable because the CEO answers to the board. And oftentimes the board only cares about how much percentage of profit we're doing this year.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. So I'm wondering what your sort of pushback is on that from a conscious leadership point of view.
I have a couple of thoughts. So obviously, as I refer back to the idea that, I mean, embodiment is the most important thing. Like the leadership has to embody in an authentic way whatever they want the organization to be.
Yep.
And I understand like that might seem like like too simplistic. But the thing I would say is that people care about what they create. And so organizations, they need a new model, right? The old model in like, I would say, and this is not just me that's saying this, like you know, a lot of smart people have researched this, right? For many years, there was the rate of change, right? It was going along and things were changing, and it was changing, and our ability to adapt was like relatively keeping up with that, right?
Sure.
And then at a certain point, the rate of change went on an extreme curve.
Yeah.
Exponential curve. We see it all the time. 6 months ago, I would have said the words Chat GPT, and you would have said, "What's that?" And now it's like everywhere, right? And so our ability to adapt, though, has not kept up with that.
No.
And so in the old version, where we could sort of keep up with the rate of change, then it was okay for a few leaders to have the answers. That's kind of the 1.0 model in a world where there's just too much change happening at the same time. You really need a much more of a whole system approach. And the way that, you know, we talk about it in the facilitation community that I'm a part of is that it's not so much about a few people having all of the answers. It's about many people, like the entire system, having better questions. And so, the head of IBM, or former head of IBM, Thomas Watson, he said, you know, our intelligence in the future will be measured not by the quality of our answers, but by the quality of our questions.
Yes.
And so my invitation to people is that actually, if you as the leader are feeling overwhelmed with demands, it's because you're creating a system where everybody is coming to you to answer those demands. And that whole thing needs to be flipped on its head, where you're actually creating a container and an environment for the resources and the answers to emerge. And the beauty of creating a system in that way is that as you allow those answers to emerge from the people that are within your system, then they're actually going to create something that they care about. They're going to be more motivated and driven in order to follow through on those things. And so the forklift operator has insights on your company that you will never know unless you create an opportunity. And so, philosophically, I really believe that in our current world, the job of leaders is to do the work. I mean, to go back to what we've been talking about, like there's this ego. It's painful to be like, oh, I don't have all the answers, but I'm the CEO. Like, it's painful to let go of that idea. But what's emergent, what's required is a CEO or a leader that can actually sort of put that aside. They can sit shoulder to shoulder with the people that are actually the ones that are making their company run, and say, hey, what ideas do you have? How might we be asking better questions about this? How might we be creating a future that we are all inspired by? That's not just a couple of us decided in a room that, hey, all right, everybody, this is your mission, vision, and values. Now go be it. It's how do you create, choreographies and interactions and ways of being that all of those things can actually emerge organically within the system.
Beautiful. What a great place for us to finish. Thank you, Peter. This has been a pleasure and an honor, sir. I would love for you to tell people where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful resources that you have. If you could do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. PeterKatzSpeaks.com is probably the best place for all of this work that we've been talking about. And of course, there's PeterKatz.com as well for more of the music side of things. And then I'm on socials at Peter Katz Music, and Katz is Katz or Katz. And I just want to thank you, Dov. I just really appreciate the way that you show up for this conversation and all of your wisdom. There's just a lot of a synergy and synchronicity between the concepts that you share and what I was excited to talk about.
Thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure and honor having you with us. Hope you'll stay with us to the end. And for you, dear listener, remember, we're going to post all the links in the show notes. But if you, for some reason, missed what was going on in part one, you just happen to show up in part two, that's great. But there's a lot of good stuff in part one. It's full of nuggets. Go back, listen to part one. And you know what? You hear me say this all the time. I encourage you to listen to a show more than once, because most of us are not listening to podcasts just listening to them. We're usually doing something else. And there's a lot of good stuff you actually missed. So I encourage you to listen, take out a pen and paper, go back and just see what you can apply, because there's so much value here that you can apply and make a difference in your life and the lives of those that you lead. Remember that those who control meaning for the tribe also control the movement of that tribe. And by generating meaning, by actually eliciting that from your people, you're going to get a lot better results in what it is you're doing. Business and political leaders committing to making positive changes to shaping politics and business landscape in ways that are more powerful. They know they got to tap into what drives human behavior. And you can tap into just that by understanding the anatomy of meaning extracted from the emotional source code. I'm Dov Barron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribes, because unified, actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for all individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the gifts in all the things that you've learned that are still locked inside of a box, whether there's other places that it can be used and put out into the world. And to remember that leadership requires you to live it before anyone else can. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, in your life, and in your leadership impact. And I am out.